Hello, and welcome to Lion and Mouse Commentary. I'm Holland, and this is my best friend Tori.
Hello.
If you're new to our show, we rank various forms of entertainment by different categories out of a total score of 10, with only 2 points allowed for our personal taste. Don't worry, we break down everything as we go. Feel free to agree, disagree, or just find something new to enjoy. Just be sure to tread lightly, there will be hot takes and spoilers. And cut to the intro. Alright, so if you've already read the title, you know that I have chosen Avatar the Last Airbender, the Netflix series, episode 1, for us to review. This was blind to both of us. We both, if you've listened to our podcast for season 1 and the rest of this season, you know that we are fans of the original animated series.
Big fans. And
so we were both very hesitant to watch the Netflix version, just because change is hard, but I forced us to by choosing this topic. So I do have a bit of a lengthy backstory to this, or facts, spoiler-free information about this. So bear with me, as this is going to kind of cover a little bit of some controversy in the backstory of the making of this series, so just bear with me. So, Avatar the Last Airbender is the title of the show. It's an American fantasy drama television series adapted by Albert Kim for Netflix. It is a live-action adaptation of the animated television series of the same name created by Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko for Nickelodeon. So, if you want more information about that, the original, you can go back and listen to our previous episodes about season 1 of that. So this series, produced by Netflix, was announced in September 2018 with DiMartino and Konietzko attached as both executive producers and showrunners. However, in June 2020, the pair departed the series over creative differences. In August 2021, Kim was officially announced as a writer, executive producer, and showrunner. In September 2018, Netflix announced, so this is back in kind of the premise, Netflix announced that a reimagined live-action remake of Avatar was to start production in 2019. The announcement of DiMartino and Konietzko leaving the series was revealed after DiMartino published an open letter on his own website on August 12th, 2020. The pair cited differences in their approach to the show compared with Netflix's version, also citing a, quote, negative and unsupporting, end quote, environment during their time with the studio. The duo ultimately received writing credits for the first and 6th episodes. In August 2021, Albert Kim was officially announced as writer, executive producer, and showrunner. He commented in a blog post, quote, "My first thought was, why? What is there I could do or say with the story that wasn't done or said in the original?" End quote. Oh, no, sorry, that's not the end of the quote. He continues, "But the more I thought about it, the more intrigued I became. We'll be able to see bending in a real and visceral way we've never seen before." End quote. In the same post, Kim emphasized, quote, "Throughout this process, our byword has been authenticity, to the story, to the characters, to the cultural influences. Authenticity is what keeps us going, both in front of the camera and behind it," end quote. Dan Lin, Lindsay Liberator, Michael Goy, and Roseanne Leong were also announced as executive producers, with Goy and Leong both directing episodes of the series. In the first season, each episode reportedly cost more than $15 million to make.
Ooh.
Production and filming began in Vancouver, British Columbia on November 16th, 2021. Principal photography wrapped on June 17th, 2022. The first season, which is currently available, was released on Netflix on February 22nd, 2024, with 8 episodes in total, running between 47 to 63 minutes in length, and garnered mixed reception from critics. Avatar the Last Airbender topped the weekly global Netflix chart from February 19th through the 25th, with 154 million hours watched by 21.2 million viewers in its first week. In March 2024, the series was renewed for a second and third season. The cast list includes, which I'm going to probably butcher quite a few of these names, includes Gordon Cormier, Kia Wentio, Ian Owsley, Dallas Liu, Paul Sun-Hyung Lee, Ken Leung, and Daniel Dae Kim. And I probably butchered all of those names, so I apologize if any of them are listening, or if you have similar names and you're listening too. So this is the Netflix synopsis, which is like one sentence, and it's not ideal, but it's what we got. Here's the synopsis. A young boy known as the Avatar must master the 4 elemental powers to save a world at war and fight a ruthless enemy bent on stopping him. The first episode is what we will be reviewing today. It's called Aang, and it was directed by Michael Goy, and writing credits include the teleplay being by Albert Kim, Michael Dante DiMartino, and Brian Konietzko. So that's some information. If you want more information about the original Avatar the Last Airbender, I recommend you either watch that for yourself or go listen to our previous podcast episodes. At least in my review of this, I'm going to kind of assume that you're familiar with it in some of my discussion and critiques. So if you're not, I apologize for that, but we will try to be as, objective as we can, viewing this as kind of a standalone concept. But it is probably going to be pretty difficult for Tori and myself because we are fans of the original show. So with that, Tori, why don't you kick us off in the first category?
Okay. So the first category is plot, story, and cohesion. We have 2 possible points, and I gave this a considerably generous half point.
That's surprising for you to give it so low.
It's very difficult, and I'm going to go ahead and acknowledge the fact that I know that my review is colored and tainted by my knowledge of and love for the original series. I fully acknowledge that. I think genuinely, if I had no frame of reference, my score for this would be generally higher. I'm going to just go ahead and say that. So I know that we try very hard to be objective and not let our personal taste and preference color every category. But even aside from personal taste, just having the knowledge of the world, characters, and series that I have hurts when watching this.
And also, to be fair, in our scoring category, we take into consideration how well a piece of media was adapted
from a source
material. So that allows us, by our own standard, of course we're allowed to do that, but by our own true attempt at objectivity, we do allow ourselves to acknowledge whether or not it was true to the source material.
So that's kind of the blanket over basically everything I'm going to say in this episode. But let me talk about plot, story, and cohesion. So I think what everything hangs on for me is the fact that I don't like when any piece of media relies on lengthy explanation to deliver a story. I am much more of a proponent of show me, don't tell me, and there is almost all tell me in this episode. They overcomplicate the first half of this episode, and it is not until practically 30 minutes in that we get any semblance to the beginning of the animated series. The information they give you previous to that, the first 30 minutes of the episode, is not information that is necessarily incorrect. However, I don't see any benefit to that piece of backstory and world building and character context. I don't see any benefit to giving us that first. I think they are important story pieces that are naturally given to us later on in the series in the animated version, and I don't see the need or reason for stuffing it down our throats in the very beginning. There's so much focus on backstory in that first half. Yes, okay, sure. We get that Aang is an airbender and that he grew up in an air temple, but they're combining all of these, in my opinion, intentional pacing moments that are present in the original series. And they take all these intentional pacing moments and they say, well, instead of finding this out later, we want you to know this now. And I think what happens is by giving us all of this information, we're not attached to any of the people yet in the backstory. So the backstory just feels sloggy. It's it's pointless. It's too much. It's makes you feel, if you had no knowledge of the Avatar world, I think it would overwhelm you, because I think you're given all this information with sort of this caveat that you should already understand how bending works and how the politics of the world sit. And so it feels insanely complicated to shove all of this into the first 30 minutes. I hate that I feel like you have to like push through all of that, and then finally you're like, oh my goodness, it's a scene I recognize. We're finally in the water, like in the Water Nation, the Southern Water Tribe. But then by the time you're there, you're exhausted. And it makes that whole second half of the first episode, which is really the part that the first couple episodes of the animated series is based off of, now it feels incredibly underwhelming. I feel like all of your stakes have already been shown. The appearance of the Fire Nation into the Water Tribe after, Aang has been released from the iceberg and he's come back to the village and he's rested and he's met Katara and Sokka. Now the Fire Nation arrives and like you don't even really care, because you've already spent all of this time fully understanding the Fire Nation's history, motivations, and goals. And I think that all I kept thinking in the second half of the episode is like, why do I want to continue to watch this if I already know all of the reasons for everything? And I know that sounds kind of silly, because like sometimes you kind of do want to know the reason behind, but the incredibly special thing about the original series is that you are given every piece of information when you need it and not a moment before. And so to be given all of this information that you don't need yet to truly understand and be drawn into the world, it makes it felt like it cut the attachment to wanting to know why and what will happen next. And I understand that it's all backstory. It's not like we were looking forward in the future or anything. But again, I think it's backstory that's important to grasp after we already know who Aang is. And then we can understand by the time Aang gets to the air temple that has been destroyed. Now we're like, at this point, we're like, oh, well, we already know what happened. Instead of, oh my gosh, what happened to Aang and his people? I really hope that we as an audience member can learn about that and experience that with Aang. All of that is missing. You are given no learning moments with your characters. And it's just sad to see. And I think it's super weird, honestly, to start the entire show, like first scene, is Sozin deciding he's going to start war? Like, but there's no intrigue to that. Like, okay, cool. Now we've full circled. We have basically we have, I don't know. I don't want to repeat myself a bunch, but I just think it was like a terrible choice in regards to storytelling.
Well, and also, if I was a new viewer of this show, I would think that Sozin surely he's the main villain then. That
Bro's
we're supposed to
literally
he's
dead.
dead. Like,
so why is it, and that's what I mean, is like, it's not necessary
right.
for us to have this scene right now. This is we're 12 episodes in. Why don't you really tell me, like,
who decided?
What is the Fire Nation like now, and how did it get this way?
Right.
But let us have an attachment to the chase that Zuko gives to Aang, but that's missing too.
I also think that like it's so irrelevant, completely irrelevant, that Sozin let an Earth Kingdom soldier run away with his battle plans to deceive the Earth Kingdom to think that they're going to be attacked so that he can go get the Air Nation.
Literally
that is so
none of
useless.
That. None of that has anything to do with the discovery of Aang. And that's really what the first episode is about and should be the focus of. The focus is, who is the kid in the iceberg? Why is he dressed in airbender clothes. We haven't seen that in 100 years. What are you talking about? He's the Avatar. Holy crap, he's the Avatar. What will we do now? Fire Nation has arrived. We got to get out. That's the focus. So why are we adding so much that just slows it down, slogs it down, kills the intrigue and discovery that is supposed to be present?
And takes up all the time away. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to interrupt you, but
fine.
It takes up all the time away from learning who the heck these people are.
Right.
Because we're just learning this happened, then this happened, then this happened, instead of figuring out who these people are that we're watching.
And because of that, it makes the source of the first episode's conflict so confusing. Because now you're like, I don't actually know, who I should be, rooting for, rooting against, what should I be focused on? What's the highest priority here? Because everything is just it's basically tossed in a pot and souped down, and none of it makes any sense. So it's just a very confusing, messy, muddy delivery of this story. Other small weird things, and then I'll be done. I am so sorry to anybody who likes this, but I physically cringed when Gran started giving the opening speech. When she said, Earth, air, whatever. And I was like, oh no. And I was at my sister's house while I was watching this, and I looked at my sister, and my sister looked at me, and I said, oh no. And my sister went, yeah. And
Long ago, the Four Nations.
And I'll talk about it again in characters, I'm sure, but it felt so unnatural where it was at. And I'm sure that they were trying to give the nod to the original fans, but it felt so fake and contrived and forced that I could not, I literally physically cringed. I was like, I can't even listen to this. It felt like a parody. It felt like I was watching a YouTube parody of your 14-year-old neighbor and his best friend are out in the front yard, and they're doing their airbending, and they're making their video for YouTube. That's kind of what it felt like.
In 2006.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, right after the show came out. So I was, it's just, it was bad. Another weird thing. Okay. This is just a question I'm going to pose. But I thought about it for the second half of the episode. Why does Zuko have on his shelf of things in the boat these Avatar sensing trinkets? What the heck is that? What the heck is that? We have a divining rod for the Avatar now? If that was the case, you guys would have definitely found him in less than 100 years. It would have eventually led you to this, to the iceberg. How did you get those? Who made them? How come they have not yet been put to use? I have maybe...
And why does he have a notebook full of drawings of past avatars? What does he care who the past avatars are? I mean, I get that a little nod of his character was I read that Avatar Kyoshi wiped out a whole Earth Kingdom army, blah, blah, blah. So I'm trying to prepare to fight the Avatar. It's so why are you writing a diary about the Avatars?
And maybe later on, I haven't watched anything past this episode yet. I don't know if I will. Spoilers, but I'm not super into it. But I was just so confused, and maybe it's answered later, but I was like, that's a very handy tool. How come it's just now a thing? And I don't know. It's just, I'm just going to sum it up over messy. It's messy and it's overcomplicated, and it doesn't need to be. And I don't know if the intention here was the original series is too simple, so we're going to throw some extra elements in to get adult audiences to watch. I bet you could ask any Avatar the Last Airbender fan who is an adult. There is nothing wrong with how the story is delivered in the original series, and that's why we like it. And
I think of the whole original series, I think there's like a total of maybe 1 to 3 episodes that you would find like fans of the show would say that they skip that episode because they don't like it.
Yeah.
Out of what, like 60 episodes?
Mm-hmm.
That's a feat.
Yeah. And so I just think that, like, I don't know what the intention was. I really don't understand it. But whatever they were going for fell flat and did not work. And in fact, was a detriment to the storytelling of this first episode. So 0.5 point, and that's generous, I think, out of 2.
All right. Well, not surprisingly, I also gave this 0.5 point out of 2. I agree with a majority. Actually, I agree with all the points you've made. I wouldn't say I agree with some of the points. Like, a lot of the points you made were also notes that I had written. I think there are so many plot holes in this first episode that are not explained, and it doesn't feel like they are holes that were made with the intention of filling in later. Sometimes you can watch the first episode of a TV show and know, oh, I don't really get that, but it feels like it fits the world, so it's going to make sense later, right? This episode, I feel like, had a lot of moments where it was like, what? That doesn't make any sense, and it was just an oversight of the show. To be 100% honest, the only reason I really struggled with scoring this whole show, because I really wanted to be objective, and Tori and I both, I don't mean to speak for her, but Tori and I both work really hard in preparing for this podcast and scoring things and reviewing things, because we want to do a good job and we want to be as objective as we can.
And sometimes it's hard, I think, to like separate ourselves from something that we do care about a lot. But we do make that effort. We make that effort to, like, just because we like something doesn't mean it's good, or just because we dislike something doesn't make it bad. And so, like, we do make that effort. It's difficult sometimes, but we do it.
But also, I think that it is important to know that we are still individuals and our word is not law. And so when you're listening to this episode, you really are getting a review from 2 fans of the original work. So I'm sure there are people that have never seen the original series and they would give a completely different review because they really are watching it blind from a completely objective lens. So maybe that's a highlight for you when you're listening. But I think overall, the only reason I gave this 0.5 point at all was because of the original source material. The overall plot of the Avatar, a young boy who is the Avatar needs to master all 4 elements to bring balance to a world that's at war, and he meets friends who are other benders and has a backstory of being the last of his kind, if you will. I think that is a great plot. And to be fair to this media, that is still the plot of this show. Mm-hmm. And that is still the plot of this episode. And they start you telling you that the world is at war, and they end with the Avatar, Aang, deciding he's going to do what it takes to bring balance back to the world. And they kind of bookend those 2 pillars, and I think overall that is a good plot. But I do think that Netflix does not get credit for that. But as an episode, as a whole, with this episode, that is in fact the plot of this episode, and it is a good basis for a plot. So that, to be 100% honest, I think all of that credit goes to the original creators of the show, but it is in fact the plot of this episode, so I felt like I had to give some credit to it, although I'm sure I'm contradicting myself with some One Piece episodes or previous stuff that we've reviewed that are based on a source material.
We're not perfect.
And me saying that, Netflix shouldn't get credit for something that it didn't create. So I understand that I might be contradicting myself here, but I'm human, so it is what it is. So I think, just like you said, all of this exposition at the beginning is problematic for this episode. But I also think that they really back themselves into a corner by giving Aang's backstory and this war origin backstory. I think it set a very, very difficult tone to follow in this show. And I think that what we're experiencing, contrasting to the animated show, what we experience is that Aang fully, maybe not fully, but very much understands the gravity of being the Avatar. He understands the significance of being the Avatar because we watch him have that interaction with Monk Gyatso. We see that he understands that the whole world is at war, and then he understands that it's his job to bring balance back to the world, and he understands and accepts all of that in the course of this first episode. And I think that that's a real problem because we don't watch any change or growth. We don't get to see Aang slowly grow and change his mind. We have him experience all of that immediately. And I do take that into consideration in the character category as well, but that's the whole plot of this episode, is we're telling you it's a war. It's very much tell me instead of showing me. We're telling you that there's a war, and then here's the Avatar, he understands what that means, and he's gonna accept his role and do his job. It takes Aang in the animated series like the entire half of the first season to even understand what it even means to be the Avatar and to be the balance between the nations and to be the balance between the spirit world and to understand how important the war is and that there is a war and that, I don't get along with the Fire Nation because guess what? They kidnapped me and captured me.
It's like again, it's kind of like what I mentioned. It's like, they give you so much in the beginning of this first episode that it's like, okay, where do we go from here? All of the places that, if you're a fan of the original show, that these characters go in a satisfying way, it's like, we've already gone there. So like, now we can't.
What was the point?
Right.
So now we're just going to watch these monotone characters through a monotone plot because we've already been told everything we need to know. So again, I also consider that as a character note, but I'm mentioning it in plot first. Aang's backstory, there's way too much expositional dialogue. It's so boring. It feels super campy. The whole thing when Gyatso tells him that he has to remember who you are, I'm like, am I watching The Lion King? Like, we can't come up with anything original, or just remember who you are, Aang. And that's the real emphasis. I felt like that was the real emphasis. And then I was like, okay, we're gonna bookend that into when Aang sees the death of the air nomads and sees Monk Gyatso's body, and he goes into the Avatar state. I was like, oh, they're gonna, and Katara's way too far away, so she doesn't snap him out of his, Avatar state like in the animated show. So instead, we have Aang just have this internal, process, and I'm like, oh, it's gonna be, remember who you are, Aang, which doesn't make sense because he's the Avatar in the Avatar state, so that is who he is being the Avatar in the Avatar state, so that doesn't work. So then how does Aang get out of the Avatar state? He remembers Gyatso saying, I will always be your friend. He's dead! What? That's what snaps him out?
I'm sorry, but this is one of the episodes that I wish we had, video filmed this because Holland's face was 100% serious and it was very amusing.
It's true though. I'm gonna come out of the Avatar state and come out of my rage and grief by remembering that the guy that's dead will always
been for 100 years
will always be my friend, but he can't because he's dead. Are you kidding me? Your writers couldn't even think to book in something a little better for you?
Holland, that's the power of friendship.
Apparently, the power of friendship is what
friendship is magic. This is My Little Pony now.
I was like, this is ridiculous. So even the backstory that we're given, which is way too boring and so much exposition and has emotion that's poorly placed and tone that's just weird, and we don't even bring a nice thread to the end of the episode where it has any relevance at all. Right. It literally was just given to us for exposition and nothing else.
Right.
And that's just poor storytelling.
It is.
That's just bad storytelling.
And it also makes, it gives the implication that your audience is an idiot.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I feel like is a huge problem with this plot overall, is it just really insults the intelligence of your audience. Which is infuriating to me because the original series was written for children and it didn't insult a child's intelligence. And this show may or may not be designed for children. I don't know. I've never seen any statement on whether or not this is the intended audience, what the age of the intended audience is for this show, but maybe this is supposed to be for kids and they're really dumbing it down so that kids can follow. I don't know.
Then they did a terrible job if it's supposed to be for kids by starting out with the tone of war.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm not saying that war is not a present and prevalent thing in the original series. It obviously is. I mean, the entire overarching plot is that Aang must restore balance before Sozin's comet, you know. And so, like, that, it is an important thread, but like you said, the tone is laid in those first couple scenes.
And so because of that tone that's immediately set off at the beginning, it doesn't make any sense for Aang, when he is out of the iceberg, to have any amount of levity when he finds out what's happened since he's been in the iceberg. So this happy-go-lucky Aang that we meet in the original series almost cannot exist in this show because we've set the tone so heavy.
And he knows too much.
Yeah.
Even when he's released from the iceberg.
Yeah.
He knows too much.
He knows way too much.
He's got the burden already on him.
Right. Couple other things. I think that the change from the original of having Aang fly around without a glider is insanely stupid.
Yeah.
One, it doesn't look good. So, I mean, consider that a note in aesthetics. I don't think it looks good at all. Two, it doesn't make a lot of sense that you could move air currents around a human being with enough force to make them fly off of the ground as weightless as Aang does. So, it really doesn't make any sense physically, where I feel like the original series, of course it's a cartoon and this is a fantasy story, but I feel like there was some acknowledgement of gravity and physics in the original, and it would make sense for a glider, for you to bend air currents around a glider the same way a hang glider enables you to glide, versus having enough air force to lift a human being off the ground. That's an insane amount of wind you would have to move.
The only argument I have for that is, well, there are the elements of, like, Aang making, like, the air ball and then riding on that, but that was not what was happening.
No, not at all. He's floating around literally weightless.
Right.
Which, throw that into my aesthetics category as well, but I'm mentioning it here in plot because it undoes something later in the episode. So when Aang is on Zuko's ship and he's flying away on his glider and Zuko throws a fireball at him and it burns his glider and Aang is falling out of the air, why are we worried about this boy being in peril? He's not in peril. Can't he just fly around?
Right.
And fly away?
Right.
So there's no peril. I don't care. I just watched him for the past, hour of the episode float around like Superman. So why am I worried that he's falling out of the sky and Sokka grabbed his arm? Thanks, Sokka. Like, you didn't save him. He could have just flown away like Superman.
Yeah.
Like, you did. So things like that are, again, I feel like these are not intentional oversight. These are legitimate oversights in the show that is undoing important points that are changing things about this series that don't need to be changed.
Right.
I think it's ridiculous that we watched Sozin grab the arm of the Earth Kingdom guy, and the Earth Kingdom guy literally catches his whole body on fire and combusts, and then he does the same thing with the airbenders. He shoots a fireball at them and their entire body bursts into flames, which is extremely graphic. If you have little kids, maybe preview this episode before you let them watch it, because that's pretty intense. A whole body is burning. But when did humans become flammable? I get that you can make fire with your hands, but why are you putting an incendiary
and it doesn't make
point at someone's arm and their entire body catches fire?
So Zuko, he is scarred from fire, but if people can just catch fire like that, Why didn't Zuko just burst into flames? Right. Is it because he's a firebender? Are they somehow exempt? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense.
So it's like, here's a change that they're like, oh, let's do this. It'll be really cool because Sozin can just like, look, he's on fire himself. Isn't that cool? No, it's not cool. It makes no sense. He literally people now can just spontaneously combust if a firebender touches them with flame. It makes no sense. Like, and Zuko shooting the fireball off the ship, it goes insanely far.
Yeah.
Like, it was just ridiculous.
Like, bro, this is the exiled prince.
Right.
Like, there's no way. He definitely could have held his own against his dad, if that's how powerful his fireballs are.
Yeah. Why does Katara know how to fly Appa? Has she ever ridden on Appa? We didn't see it. Does she know how to make Appa go up in the air? Nope, we didn't see that. Because we didn't watch them ride on Appa and get back to the water tribe on Appa's back because he was in the iceberg. No, we watched Aang blow a whistle and Appa flew in, and then that was the end of that. And then now Katara knows magically how to ride him and make him fly to go rescue Aang? No, that doesn't make any sense. Where was Appa when Zuko was fighting Aang?
Great question.
Where was he?
Snacking with Gran, I guess.
I guess so. How did Aang know that Gyatso was Gyatso when all of the air nomads are wearing the same necklace?
Good question.
How did Aang know that was Gyatso?
It's because that's his eternal friend.
Apparently, he had the power of friendship.
He had the power of friendship, the magic of friendship.
It was ridiculous. So just some other things. I agree. I completely hated Gran's little speech. It was terrible. It was not fan service. It was desecration of what fans love.
It was genuinely cringy.
It was so bad. And her delivery was bad, but I'll get into that in characters. It was just terrible. I thought it was really stupid when Aang was telling Katara about bending, and he tells her that she just has to let go. I just felt like we just stole that from Frozen. You know, why? Mm-hmm. Like, we can't come up with an original concept at all, apparently.
Nope.
The whole part when the kids in Sokka's village start throwing rocks at the Fire Nation was so stupid. Why is the Fire Nation getting beaten by kids throwing rocks? That was just ridiculous. Iroh, when he's in there with Aang and Aang asks him why the war started. Why did we need to have that conversation? Why? What was the point of that? It added nothing to the episode. Mm-hmm. It's completely ill-placed. It feels like we just switched gears really rapidly. Like, why would anyone have that conversation in that setting at that time? No one. It's ridiculous. Like, this would be a conversation for later time. And
yeah.
Like, it was ridiculous. Like, so much of it was like, this just doesn't even make sense. Like, aside from the fact that you've changed things from the original, let's just take that off the table. None of these were just even thought through enough to make it make sense.
And that's the thing, is that I don't necessarily hate changes as long as they further the plot in a way that makes sense, does not take away from or counteract any existing rules in your world, plot, or characters, those sorts of things. Like, I'm not against change, but if all of your changes ruin what is so charming about the source material, then no, I don't want you to change it.
Yeah. So those were some of my like smaller notes, but my biggest problem with the plot was exactly what you talked about, Tori, was the fact that they give you all this exposition up front versus the way that, you know, again, comparing to the animated, but it still is good storytelling with unveiling things slowly so that you find out as these characters find out, and you walk into this world slowly and peel back layers like an onion versus you being told straight from the get-go, there's a war, here's Aang, all his people died, he's the Avatar, what's that? We're going to tell you all of that. and he needs to master all 4 elements, and Zuko's every premise of the show basically was given to you in the span of not even the whole episode, because there were other parts, and it's too much too fast, and it really made for a boring episode. But then it also is just like, it's just not a good plot for a first episode. I don't understand why anyone, that whether they were a fan of the original or not, would keep watching after this episode, because the plot just falls flat so quickly. So again, 0.5 point out of 2, but really that's only because the notes of the plot that are the overarching plot from the animated series is a good plot. Not that I think Netflix deserves the credit for that, but that's why I gave it 0.5 point.
Okay, so the next category is characters. And out of 3 possible points, I gave this 1 point. And I will explain a little bit why. First, let's talk about all of the things I don't like. Katara is the flattest depiction that I could have possibly imagined. Every line that Katara says is delivered like she is reading her lines off of a cue card behind the camera. And that's unfortunate. I think that actress probably could do better. I'm going to blame directing, but it happens to fall under characters here. Zuko does not seem angry, which I think is a huge facet to his character, because he's so bitter and jaded about his situation and his relationship with his family, and he's so consumed by that bitterness that he lashes out in anger at like everything. And he does not seem that angry to me. He just seems kind of anxious, which I think is a really weird shift in our first antagonist of the series. Like, aside from the Fire Nation as a whole, but that honestly shouldn't even be a facet in the first episode because of reasons already explained. So what should be our first antagonist is Zuko. And he's literally he kind of just acts like a stressed boss. Like, he's just having a bad day. But he doesn't actually give any vibes of like actual anger, which I think it's weird to have that missing in Zuko as a character in the beginning. Iroh is a character that, oh my God. I mean, we've talked about Iroh in length in other episodes, but like, Iroh's purpose in the show is that he is wise and steady and does not falter in the face of whatever. Like, he is meant to be that way. And he's also kind of funny. Like, he is one of the characters that I would consider to be comic relief at some points. Not all times, but he does have these moments of joviality. He's a jovial character. And all of that jovial sense about Iroh is completely missing. He looks and feels and reads on screen exhausted. Like, he's exhausted, which is... Sure, I guess logistically he probably kind of tired. I mean, I'm not going to acknowledge that, but for me to look at Iroh and the only character trait that I'm seeing in this depiction of Iroh is that he's tired and he's old and he likes tea. Like, it's just such a disservice to the character of Iroh, who is so wonderfully layered and consistent. Iroh is one of the most consistent characters in the series. And we don't even get a glimpse at his, I guess, steadiness in this episode at all. Because he's so confusing and watered down. Like, he's really watered down. And I just really didn't like that. I'm gonna say, for the most part, I think visually the cast is fine. I do agree. I was talking to Holland a little bit before we started that I think Sokka and Katara don't really look like they're very close siblings. However, I think individually they look okay. I actually think it's kind of strange how the actor who plays Sokka has a jaw and chin very similar to Sokka. I don't know if you noticed that, but like his face shape is very correct. So I think he looks okay for the part. There are two things though that I don't like about him. He does look a little too old to be playing Sokka, and I understand that Sokka is a year or two older than Katara, but I think that Katara looks much too young or Sokka looks much too old. There's too much of a disconnect, I think, between their ages. They look farther apart than they're supposed to be in age, and
they look more like 17 or 18 and 13, 14,
right,
versus like 15 and 13.
Yeah. So I just think they look a little too far apart. Now, my next note about Sokka, I actually think may not necessarily be, well, I guess it is kind of a character issue, but I think the root of this character issue is the tone issue that we were talking about in plot, because the tone is set to basically leave very little room for levity and joy and humor. And so Sokka, the whole time I was watching Sokka, I was thinking like, where is the funny parts of Sokka? Like, Sokka is probably the biggest comedic relief in the entire series. And not once did we get any true funny moment from Sokka. The man is stressed out from the beginning, from the first time we see him until the end of the episode. And while Sokka does have moments of stress in the original series, they're always kind of depicted in sort of like a funny way. Like he's almost too worked up about things. But in this iteration, and I think it is because of the tone of the show and how the tone is a bit more weighty, he really can't be any sillier, because then he'll seem like a jerk. And so he doesn't feel quite like Sokka, but he really can't feel like Sokka without feeling like even more disjointed from the overall like feeling of the episode. So it's just like a really strange thing that happens with Sokka, and I don't like it. Gran, I'm really sorry, Gran, but you are the worst actor in this whole episode. And we have Katara delivering lines like she's reading from cue cards. So that's quite a feat. I didn't like Gran's depiction at all. Gran is a very warm character, and I felt no warmth from the woman playing her. The delivery of her lines felt very robotic and mechanical. And I'm not going to say Katara must have got it from her, but in this depiction, I guess she did. I genuinely think the best depiction, and I still think I'm being kind of generous with this, I think the best depiction is Aang. It's just unfortunate that now he has been written as a character that knows so much of the burden and responsibility on his back by the time he is released from the iceberg, instead of discovering that and having that weight sink upon him. Because I think knowing the weight of what you have to do and your responsibilities, the Avatar, it changes the dynamic between him and Katara and Sokka. Because now it's almost the dynamic of the three of them shifts from we're going to do this and figure this out together to you two are going to be my footmen on this journey. Like, it feels like there's a power shift here. Yes, absolutely, Aang is the Avatar, and I want to acknowledge that, but I think because of the weird dynamic, the relationship with these other characters feels so different just from the get-go. And while I did enjoy the moments that I saw from Aang that were more lighthearted, most of those are all present in the flashback. And then the big dump of responsibility is put on Aang's shoulders. And from that moment on, he is acted out and delivers correctly as a burdened kid. But we lose so much of that, like, fun youth of Aang. So while I think the actor that played Aang maybe did the best with his depiction, the way that Aang is shaped from those first few scenes of the episode, it just really does a disservice. So it's almost like we have all of the characters and they're recognizable, but they are tone shifted, watered down, saddened versions of themselves. And I think if you look at the whole of what's to come, there is plenty coming down the pipeline to sadden these characters. We really don't need them to be this sad at the beginning. And so but because they're already so sad from the gate, like from the opening of the gate, it's very hard to find a lot of empathy for them at the beginning and attach yourself to them in a natural way, because you don't get to experience the lows with them because they're already in a low. And so, like when you're watching something and you experience a low with a character, then the next high they hit, it just feels so satisfying. It's like a victory for you as the audience. And it's like, I feel like we're coasting toward a victory here, but it's not, whenever it happens, it's not going to clinch us the same way. I just think it's sad. It's just an unfortunate depiction of characters. And I'm not going to say I hate them. I mean, I kind of hate Gran, and I'm not a big fan of Katara. But as far as everybody else, I'm not going to say I hate their depiction. I just think that they're just shadows of who they are in the original. And to me, it's just so sad to see. So 1 point out of 3.
All right. So I gave this, out of a total 3 point for characters, I gave it half a point out of 3. Before I forget, you kind of made me think of something. I'm going to start with Aang. So I think a huge problem in his character development, and his character can't be a lighthearted character. One, because it kind of, like I mentioned before, they set the whole tone of the episode. But I think, and this is going to sound like insignificant, but bear with me. I think a huge problem with Aang's character and why we aren't allowed to have this happy-go-lucky Aang is because they changed his motive for leaving the air temple. So in the original, he was running away from the air temple because he found out that because he's the Avatar, they're going to take him away from Monk Gyatso, who's like his kind of father figure. They're going to take him away from his surrogate dad, and he doesn't want to do that, so he's just going to run away. In this show, he tells you his motivation is, I don't want to be, when Gyatso tells him he's the Avatar, he gets super, super emotional. He's like crying, basically. And he says, I don't want to end up alone. So then he gets on Appa's back and flies away. Which, if he's flying away to run away, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
So clearly, I think he says some throwaway line that's kind of hard to hear, where he says he's basically going to go blow off some steam with Appa, take a little flight, and come back to the temple. I think that is completely changes who Aang is when he wakes up out of the iceberg. Because in the original, his plan was, I don't want them to take me away from my dad, so I'm going to run away, and, I don't want to be the Avatar, I'm going to run away, I'm going to go have fun, okay? So instead, his motive is, I'm going to be the Avatar, I'm going to leave to go train, but that's okay, because Monk Gyatso's going to always be my friend, so I'm going to leave to blow off steam. So when he wakes up out of the iceberg, he has all that weight of being the Avatar.
Right.
And all of that, his mentality waking up out of that iceberg has to be, well, I got to get back to the air temple to go leave my dad and go train to be the Avatar, which is all really sad and heavy. All of that weight we saw at the beginning has to be continued for the rest of this show, because we didn't have this picture of this impulsive, happy-go-lucky kid that's like, you know what, I'm just going to leave on Appa, and you know what, I'm just going to go run away and go be a kid, because I'm not ready to, go be the Avatar yet, and I don't want to be taken away from my people, so I'll just leave of my own volition. That's not the Aang we have in this show. And I think that immediately is changing his character, and I don't know how you can kind of come back from that, because now you've set that bar for the rest of this show, that this is the Aang we have versus the Aang from the animated series. And I think that's kind of problematic. It removes that levity and that, happy-go-lucky kid who's a little impulsive. He acts without thinking. He kind of thinks everything's going to all work out in the end. That whole core of his character that we're introduced to at the beginning of the animated series, none of that is present. I don't have a problem overall with these characters. I don't have a problem with the casting. I think there's some parts where the casting has kind of missed the mark. But overall, my biggest problem with these characters are they are extremely flat. They have no depth. They don't feel like real people at all. With Aang, I think that there's a huge continuity issue here where Gyatso tells him he's the Avatar, and his reaction is almost over dramatic when Gyatso tells him that. And then he starts basically, he literally, his eyes well up with tears when he's being told this news. And he's just so overcome with emotion, being told that he's the Avatar. And there's all this weight of that role. And he doesn't want to do that, but he's going to have to leave to go complete his training. There's all this emotional response from Aang just by being told he's the Avatar. And we get zero of that when he finds out his entire people there's been a genocide against the entire Air Nation. Explain that. Here's a 12-year-old kid finding out he's the Avatar and basically crying. And when he sees Gyatso's body, which how he knows that that's Gyatso's body, we don't know. But when he sees his surrogate dad's body, he doesn't even cry.
Yeah.
He's walking around a destroyed air temple that was his home where his people lived, and he's just as expressionless and emotionless as if he's walking through the mall. Explain that to me. And I'm not calling it out on this kid, because this actor is the age that Aang would be. This is a directing problem. You were able to get so much emotion out of this actor.
Pretty much all of these issues are directing issues.
Problems. But you were able to get so much emotion out of this actor when he's told he's the Avatar, and you don't get any emotion out of this actor when he finds out his entire people have been wiped off of the planet. Explain that for me. That makes no sense whatsoever. I don't think that, I know that the actor that plays Aang is fairly popular, and he's gotten a lot of positive praise, and I think that there's warrant to that. I think he does the best with what I don't doubt his ability, but in this episode, he doesn't look like he's that great of an actor, in my opinion. He seems like he's not a very good actor. I feel like also the way that all of the other characters talk, I think there's some problems with overall delivery of dialogue, but with Aang, he really doesn't feel like his voice and his cadence doesn't feel like it fits the world of Avatar, where all these other characters, when they speak, it sounds like they fit the world. This Aang, I feel like he's about to start talking to me about skateboarding, or start talking about some current trend. He just doesn't sound like he's from the right time period. He's from the right area. He just doesn't sound like he fits the world. And I don't know if it's just the cadence, the way he talks, or just his intonation, or just the tone of his voice. But to me, he sounds like just an American kid off the street, and not like he's from this other world. And it just doesn't feel like it meshes well with the way the other actors speak. And again, that's not the actor's fault. He just speaks the way he speaks. But I found it very odd, his voice hitting my ears after listening to all the other actors talk. It just sounded like they weren't from the same universe. So I feel like maybe his voice tonally would fit Guardians of the Galaxy, but not Avatar the Last Airbender.
Okay.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And again, that's not really a critique on the actor, but I just thought it was really odd. I agree with pretty much everything you said for Sokka and Katara. Katara is so melancholy. She's super, super like almost depressed throughout this whole episode, and we don't have any depth as to why. It's almost like the director told her, "You're sad because your mom died," and that's the one character note she has for the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's like there's more depth to a person than, yeah, she's sad that her mom died, but there's other depth to her character. There should be, and there wasn't. There are a couple moments where she interacts with Sokka and she teases him, and I feel like that's the only moment where we actually see how well this character is, and how well this actress can perform this character.
Yeah.
Because everything else just felt so monotone. The Sokka and Katara, I don't think they really look like siblings. It doesn't bother me that much, but I also don't feel like they really act like siblings. There's at their very first interaction with each other, they feel like they're siblings in that very first interaction when they're kind of teasing each other. Maybe Katara's just teasing Sokka, but I feel like for the rest of the episode, they feel like coworkers that are having a conversation about, we have to, meet our budget for this quarter. I mean, it just felt really very business, very matter of fact. It didn't feel like these two characters had a pre-existing relationship really at all. And I would say the same thing about Zuko and Iroh. It doesn't feel like either of them really have a pre-existing relationship up to this point. And Zuko, I think overall, he's okay. He's probably the better of the characters that feels like he's got a little bit of depth to him. But Iroh, I really don't like at all. He feels like somebody's trying to do a caricature of the animated Iroh versus either A, just making your character your own and making it new, or B, just emulating the depth that the original character had. I feel like one problem with Iroh, and again, I feel like this is a problem with the tone overall in the show, is we have to be really serious because this is a serious show. So then the levity that Iroh should have is almost non-existent. And the moments where he is kind of maybe has a little sarcastic remark or a little joke here or there, it just feels a little out of place and out of character for him.
It almost gives creepy vibes instead of like comforting old uncle vibes.
Yeah, and he feels like Iroh in the animated, like, was just a very different character than either the choice this actor made or the choice the director made, or a little bit of both. And I feel like the direction they wanted to go with this Iroh was, we're going to have a really serious Santa Claus. That's going to be Uncle Iroh.
Yeah.
And it's like, you're going to have moments where you're like, but otherwise you're dead serious, and there's nothing like, you're just this wise old sage that kind of chuckles to himself when he tells a funny joke that nobody else is going to laugh at. And it's just like, really, there's more to Uncle Iroh than that.
Right.
So it's like they took one character note for all these characters and that was it. And I just think it's a disservice to the characters of the original, but it's also a disservice to these actors, because I feel like what they're given, they're trying really hard. But I think that a problem with this is that you've casted a lot of young, inexperienced actors, and that's always a risk, but so many films have done it and it's been successful. And I feel like most studios work with these kids to get them comfortable with each other, to get them natural in their roles, to get them, do workshops with them, or have them like live together, or have them do, workshops for weeks before they start filming. And it feels like none of that effort was given to these kids so that they could do better in their own work. Yeah. And I feel like they were hired, and then they showed up to filming and they were told, your name is Katara and you're sad that your mom died. Your name is Sokka and you're agitated because you got to protect the village. And your name is Zuko and you're anxious because you might have to fight the Avatar. And your name is Iroh and you're serious, but you chuckle to yourself because you think you're funny and nobody else does. And your name is Aang and you're really overwhelmed at the weight of being the Avatar. And that's it. That's
Yeah.
all they were given. Those are their notes. Those are their characters. It's one line, one note.
There's
and that's
nothing
it.
nuanced. There's no
Nothing.
There's no nuance to any of the characters, and I think, and it's sad when an animated hand-drawn character from an original show is more nuanced than a flesh and blood actor.
Oh, after I watched this episode of Avatar the Last Airbender, the Netflix version, I turned on the first episode, season 1, episode 1 of the animated show, and I clocked it. There was more depth of character in the first 10 minutes. We got depth of character for Sokka, Katara, Aang, Zuko, and Iroh in 10 minutes.
Shout out.
More than what we got in an hour runtime.
Shout out to my sister and brother-in-law. They told me that they watched the whole season. They didn't spoil anything for me, but they watched the whole Netflix season and then immediately turned on the original show and watched the whole thing again.
Yeah. I feel like that's how you have to watch
all 3
this.
books in the next couple days.
Yeah. One note that I feel like is an issue, and again, I think it just is a testament that these kids were not given enough time, because I'm really not trying to drag on these young actors, because I think they really are trying to do a good job. But I've seen them in interviews, and I've seen them relaxed and interacting with each other, and none of that realness is present in this episode. And I think one kind of testament to that is these kids, when they're the child actors, when they're delivering their lines, it's, Tori and I were theater kids, and of course when you're growing up and you're young and you're doing theater, your biggest concern is, I want to make sure my lines are memorized, and I have to deliver them. I have to deliver the lines because I memorized them and it was really hard and I don't want to forget them. So when you deliver the lines, you tend to speak really quickly because you're trying to get them all out, because you worked really hard to memorize them, and you don't take time to put any depth or realness into what you're saying, to put any weight, put any emotion, be able to pause when it would be appropriate. And that's just part of inexperience. That's just part of being young and being new to acting or theater or film. And all of these child actors talk so fast in this show. There were multiple times where I had to kind of back it up or pause for a second to think about what they actually said. And I think that just speaks to inexperience, which is not their fault. And I think that the fault really is the same way that actors that were in, child actors that have been in films for, decades, and these classic films that are front run by child actors or a child cast, a lot of times those child actors are given a lot of time together to really get to know their characters, to get to know each other, to be comfortable. And I guess that's my biggest complaint as far as the acting goes, is I didn't see any level of comfort in these actors in their roles. They all seemed very rushed. I wouldn't say unprepared, because that would put the fault on them, but it felt like they were very rushed to prepare for these roles.
I would say that they may arguably have been unprepared, but not really from fault of their own. They just may not have been given the resources and notes necessary or the time to implement them.
Right.
And it's like, sure, when you're like on a set, you're there and you've got all the elements and you're standing in front of the camera and you do a take and you cut, but then there's your opportunity for your director to come over and be like, okay, let's try it like this, or why don't you consider this, or think on this. And it's like, it almost seems like those moments just were not present. Like they cut it and they were like, all right, flip the camera around, let's do it again. And then it's like, okay, well then I guess I'll just keep rolling with what I did. So it's like, I don't know. It just kind of seems like maybe the attention or focus was elsewhere, when really in a show like this, the focus should have been in those moments in let's get all these character nuances in here as possible.
Yeah. And I feel like the actors that seem to struggle with that the least are Zuko and Sokka, and they're older.
Yeah,
so
they are
they're
older actors.
And probably more experienced.
Which I looked up while you were talking about some of the characters, and the actor who plays Sokka was born in 2002, and the girl who plays Katara was born in 2006. So they're only 4 years apart. From my perspective, they look farther apart than that. So I don't know.
Yeah. So overall, I just think that the characters in the way that they're written and in the way that they're portrayed in this episode are they're just not good. Also with Gran, she sucks. Her dialogue is weird. She's annoying. She feels like just a robot plot convenience, and I hate her. So 0.5 point out of 3.
Okay, our third category is aesthetics, and out of 2 points, I gave this 1 point. I actually think this is probably the best of the categories that they achieved, but I also still have some problems. So let's talk about that. I'll talk about the things that I really like first. I love the costuming. They kind of nailed it, and whoever their costume team is, big props, because they genuinely look straight out of the original series. I think they did a really good job with color palettes and the cuts, and it's some of the outfits, like, I think could have had the potential to look really goofy on real flesh and blood people, and I think they did a really good job at that, especially with like the airbending outfits. I think they just kind of nailed it. But I think overall, I think a lot of the costumes and costume pieces just feel very true to the nation that they come from. They have all been fitted very nicely to the actors. I think that costuming is just really, really good. I think overall, the color palettes and lighting is really good. There are some really lovely cinematic shots. There are great shots that involve silhouette, candlelight, those sorts of things. And I think that cinematically, the cinematography is actually really nice. And I found myself thinking like, oh, wow, that looks really pretty. Or, oh, wow, that's a great establishing shot. They do a really good job at sort of the cinematography rule, which is anytime you're in a new location, you start on a wide establishing shot, then you cut into a medium, then you cut into your close-ups, and it sounds repetitive to do it that way, but the purpose of shooting that way, cinematography or like camera-wise, is it orients a viewer. And they do that a lot. And I think that was really helpful in kind of knowing where we were and also getting a chance to kind of show off the sets and things like that. I loved, this is how you do fan service, okay? It's not Gran giving a weird speech that doesn't feel genuine. The best way to do fan service in this entire episode was the ending credits. And I loved that they used the same ending credits music that the original show has. Oh, I was so happy. I was probably happier. Isn't that terrible? I was happiest at the credits.
Yep.
When the end credits started and that song started up and I was like, oh, it's the same song. I was very happy that's the proper way, I think, to do fan service.
There were a lot of score notes that came straight out of the anime.
Yeah. So I love those sorts of things are the best way to do it. Now let's talk about all the things I hated. Okay, this is a neutral, not a hate. The bending, the element itself in the effects /CG look fine. However, tracking that with the actor movement felt weirdly disjointed at times. It almost felt like the speed of the element, you would think that like the speed of the element should match the speed of the bender, right? That makes sense. It doesn't often. An actor will move and you almost want the element to feel like an extension of their body or limb, and it goes either much slower or much faster than the movement of the bender. And I thought that it was distracting to me a lot of the times, or it simply produced the element like a moment early or a moment late. It felt like there was something about the tracking or the speed of the bending quite a few times that I just didn't love. So I don't think the CG is great. Also, I really dislike having CG people when you could achieve what that CG person is doing with a real actor. And there are numerous CG people that are created for literally no reason. And a big version of this is at the end when Aang goes into like the Avatar state at the Southern Air Temple, and there's that whole process. And like, yeah, I get that the elements are gonna have to be CG because the actor cannot actually airbend, but they could have green screened Aang during that whole process and then just mapped him in and just do the effect to his eyes. They did not have to CG the entirety of Aang.
I had such a huge problem with that too. When I was watching, I'm like, why? Why?
But what all it does is distract the viewer and break the immersion.
Yeah.
Because it's not like Aang was doing anything in that moment that like would be unsafe or unrealistic for that actor to do, especially with the technology that we have of like body mapping or green screening. Like all of those things are practical CG that could be used and you'd still feel the reality of the actor. And that's just one example. But there are multiple scenes where they just produce people that don't actually exist in order to like fill space. And I did not like it at all. It made this world, this version of Avatar, this world feel way less real, because I'm like, well, half the people don't actually exist. So it doesn't feel actually populated or bustling. And to be honest, CG is expensive. It's a waste of money in a lot of these scenes because you're already going to have to use CG. So to use CG that is not necessary is, in my opinion, a poor use of resources. It takes time and money that could be used for other things. And it's no wonder that each episode took $15 million to film if this pattern continues, because that's not like a cheap thing to do. But it is in a way kind of lazy, because it's just a few people, a team sitting at their desks. And I am not in any way, let me just clarify, I'm not in any way diminishing the jobs of CG effects artists and editors. Those people are appreciated and necessary in film productions. I'm not diminishing those jobs. However, there is, if media could rely on only CG, there would be no reason for actors. So if we're going to have actors, we should use them in all ways that make sense. So I just think that that's really my biggest issue, is this use of CG that is really not necessary and really breaks a lot of the visual positives that I thought most of this episode had. It's just really, really frustrating when I'm like into a shot and then an actor turns around and they're not real. And I'm like, you couldn't even give me just like a real actor. And it's just frustrating to me. My last note is, I actually have two more notes. I put this into aesthetics, but the flying without a glider looked awful. And is dumb. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Last note is, honestly, Zuko's scar is not super convincing. I'm going to compare. I know I don't like to do it too much. I'm going to compare it to a different... It's sad when a Twilight film does better scar makeup on somebody's face than a show like this that cost this much money to make and could have afforded a really good special effects makeup artist to make his scar look convincing. I'm not trying to say that like they needed to make him look grotesque or anything, but his scar does not seem significant enough to me. And also, I think a really big thing about animated Zuko is that his scar has affected his entire eye, and it doesn't open quite as much. And you can do that with prosthetics. They could have swollen that eyelid a little bit on that actor to kind of sell the injury a little bit better, and they just chose not to.
Animated Zuko also doesn't have an eyebrow.
That's true.
And they kept his eyebrow.
That's a good point. So it's like those are small things that may not sound like a lot, but I think when you're looking at this actor who's supposed to be playing Zuko, and he's supposed to have just come out of this traumatic Agnikai with his father.
Well, it was like 3 years ago.
Sure. Okay. But still, it's like he's had this traumatic thing happen to him, and it has completely changed his face and will for the rest of his life. And so when it just kind of feels like somebody just took like a red blush and like rubbed it into his face, like it sort of makes me feel like, oh, is his injury not as significant in this version? Because if so, then that kind of diminishes a character facet of his and those sorts of things. So I just had a small issue with that as well. But it's funny because like I think with the aesthetics, I think the things that were good were really, really nice and lovely. And then the things that were bad were incredibly starkly bad. So there was really no like gray middle ground here with aesthetics. So 1 out of 2 for me.
Alrighty. I also gave this 1 out of 2 points for aesthetics. I'm going to touch on, I agree with a lot of the points you made with the bending. So I'm going to just kind of expound on that a little bit. Another issue I have with the bending, for one, I think the earth bending at the beginning looks very CGI. It does not look very convincing to me, which I think is, it's okay because it's not a huge part of the show. But I feel like if they were going to go to all that trouble to have earthbending, they should have gone to the trouble to make it look good. But yeah, that was one part where I agree. I felt like his movements didn't match what he was bending, and that was kind of it sets you up for an expectation that the bending isn't going to necessarily be realistic. It's going to be more like you have to do these moves to activate your superpowers, versus you are connecting and bending the elements around you. So I felt like the earthbending was not very good. The firebending I already talked about. I don't understand why we have to make people combustible. Why Sozin is now Combustion Man. Explain that to me. I don't know. The waterbending is not terrible, but it doesn't look like anything new. It looks like CGI water that we've had since, I don't know, the last Avatar the Last Airbender that came out. The M. Night Shyamalan movie.
Oh gosh.
It literally looks unchanged since then, and that was what, like 2010 maybe?
Yeah.
So in almost 15 years, our CGI water looks exactly the same. And then the airbending is what I have the most trouble with. The biggest gripe I have with the bending is the airbending. The airbenders. So again, comparing to the animated series, but it's the source material. So there's a huge distinction made in the second episode when Aang is on the Fire Nation's ship. The way that Aang moves and uses airbending is its own distinct style. The whole point is you are moving against the energy of your opponent. You're moving around their back. You're evading more than you're attacking. And that's kind of the hallmark of an airbender, is it's very non-combative. It's very it's kind of a pacifist's bending style. The airbending in this show has no distinct style. The airbenders just blast air at people like they're shooting photon blasts from Captain Marvel or something like that. Or they're telekinetically throwing people across the room like Jean Grey. Or, I mean, it literally is just done like we can't blast fire at you, but we're just going to blast air at you and shoot you across the room and throw you up in the air. And it's like, that's the exact opposite of what makes an airbender so unique, is that an airbender is has a completely different style, but they were literally just doing the exact same kinds of things that the firebenders were doing. They were just shooting air instead of fire. And I feel like they completely undermined the whole purpose of an airbender. And the other thing I didn't like, well, I already talked about Aang flying around like a dummy, but then also the part where he like airbends the keys off of the guard's, belt or whatever. It's like, how did that work? So physics, how much air do you have to shoot to move a whole ring of keys? Like, what? So, and the motion didn't even like move in the right way. It was just like, we have telekinesis, like 11 from Stranger Things, and we can just move things with our mind, but we're just going to call it airbending. And I feel like they just took airbending and they erased the whole point of a bending and an art, and they just made it a superpower. And I feel like that was just, it's just dumb. And visually, I think it looks really campy and corny. It makes it look like this is a child's show instead of this is a show for all audiences. Other problems I had visually, at the beginning, the very opening scene, I immediately had a problem with, we're watching this earthbender run away from guards, and all of them are just out for a nice jog. None of them are running like their life depends on it, so it really wasn't convincing that they were in danger. It literally looked like a bunch of like race runners just like cruising along. It's like, come on, that's such an easy fix. Like, just run faster. Like, come on. Another thing, Sozin's beard looks so bad. Yeah. Like, how bad is it that your first character we're introduced to has an unconvincing beard and wig? Like, really? Grand's wig as well looks terrible. Otherwise, I think the wardrobe and costuming is phenomenal, like you said, so I'm not going to rehash that, but I thought that was a very big positive. The characters' hair overall looks okay, except for the wigs that just looked really weirdly out of place. I'm shocked and actually encouraged that, or I was encouraged until I watched this episode, that they committed to Zuko's little ponytail. Yeah. Because prior iterations have not, and a lot of people have thought that it wouldn't translate well onto film.
Sokka's too, his sides are shaved and he has the ponytail.
The sides of his head aren't fully shaved.
Okay, maybe not as much, but you're right. Never mind. I redact that statement.
Yeah. But Zuko's head is basically bald except for his little diamond shaped ponytail, and I was very surprised that they committed to that.
They actually shaved the dude's head.
They did.
Yeah.
And I mean, they put, I believe from what I have seen on the internet, they put an extension in his hair for the ponytail, but they did not. They did actually shave his head. But they did a very good job, and it translated very well onto film. So that was pleasantly surprised. But I agree. I think his scar makeup is pretty disappointing. And I think that those features that have been changed, I think that was kind of a misstep there. Overall, the CGI, aside from, I agree with the points when they try and CGI people unnecessarily. Other than that, the CGI to me just feels like run-of-the-mill CGI. There's nothing that's very impressive. The bending, I was really expecting more impressiveness from the bending. The CGI that's possible with firebending and earthbending and stuff, I was expecting that to be more impressive. But even just environmentally, it just felt like there was a ton of green screen and CGI, and all of that just felt kind of run-of-the-mill, like kind of boring and then cheaper than building actual sets, which is a shame because I felt like some of the sets, like Zuko's bedroom on the ship, was actually done really well. It was great set design work. So I wanted to give some credit to that. I felt like the set designs and the props that were available were actually really good. The gate at the entrance of the water tribe, I like how they designed that. The inside of the hut where Gran gives her horrible speech, but the inside of that hut looks really good. So the set design is really, really good. And I feel like we didn't need to see all this vast landscape of CGI. We could have kept everything relatively small and just had good set work, and I felt like that would have been more impressive than the amount of CGI and green screen that are in this episode. The other thing I did want to, another reason that I gave a point, was that the score is really good. And like you said, I thought it was great fan service. There are several notes of the score that harken back to the original series, and yet it doesn't feel like you're just listening to the same soundtrack of the original show over and over and over again. Overall, I think the score was done very, very well. Oh, one thing I also thought was weird. I felt like there were some moments, there were really weird choices of camera angles. Like when they were in the hut, and Grand's giving her thing, there was like the camera seems to like tilt or angle at a different, like cant, I think is the term. And then they did it again when Aang was fighting Zuko. There's parts where it like turns to one side, and I just felt like that was just a weird choice. It didn't really feel like it
could
fit.
have been used way more creatively. Like if it was almost like the camera was an extension of the movement of like a fight or bending or something like that, it could have been way more creative. I think in this way, it just sort of gives like a weird sense of like unease.
Yeah. So, overall, I thought it was just kind of, it wasn't, the visuals of this weren't terrible, but it really wasn't anything super impressive either. So that's mostly why I gave it 1 point out of 2.
Okay, so our fourth category is personal taste and preference. Out of 2 possible points, I gave this half a point. This is a really rough start. And at this point, watching the original series is much more appealing to me than continuing this one. I'm still undecided if I'm going to continue watching the live action. I've seen some things on the internet say that the show gets better. I've had some things on the internet say the show doesn't get any better. So I'm really not sure. At this point, I'm not really motivated to do that. So the elements that felt true to the original series were all very fleeting and tiny. And I think the fact that not much feels true, it just feels like there's enough disconnect that I don't feel any attachment to this version, and therefore have no desire to see it through to the end. So the half point that I'm giving it is because of the source material and how much that I love it and am attached to that. But everything that this adaptation has done is like a shadow of that. And so if I'm going to spend my time consuming Avatar the Last Airbender, why would I not go with what I know to be good? So that's my reasoning.
All right. I actually gave this a 0 out of 2, which I'm sure for a lot of listeners is not very surprising. I will be very willing to admit that maybe this show just isn't for me. Maybe this isn't for existing fans. Maybe it's supposed to be a kids show for the new generation, that parents are going to show their kids this show versus the old animated series. Maybe this is what kids want to watch these days. Maybe it's just a sign of the changing times and how things change and get readapted for younger audiences and newer generations. And maybe this show was just not designed for me. If that's the case, I'll fully admit that and just say, you know what, it's just not for me, but it wasn't for me anyways. I'll just go back and watch the animated show. But my biggest problem, especially with this episode, is the lack of depth of the characters, and these characters are such rich characters. I mean, I'll be the first one to admit that the first season of the animated show is not my favorite. I think there's parts of it that are kind of boring. There's part where it kind of falls flat. You can go back and listen to those episodes and hear me get into more of that if you want to. But I just think overall, the worst episode of season 1 is still better than this episode.
Yeah.
And that's my least favorite season of the original series. Also, the fact that this plot was uncompelling for an entire hour. I had no desire or reason to care for these characters or to care what happens to them. And I think that's a big problem. If you can't get your buy-in with either the characters or the plot, then why would anyone watch the next episode? So I guess over a whole hour, I could have watched 3 animated episodes and had a better time and actually been given more information and more compulsion to care about the people and the plot that's surrounding them. So I guess I would just have to say that as a fan of the original show, I just really didn't like this episode at all. I don't know. Again, I don't know if I would continue watching it. I'm kind of undecided. I'm really curious as to see what happens next, but at the same time, I think that I will only be disappointed if I continue watching it. I don't think I would watch it again for enjoyment. I would just watch it, or not watch it again, but watch the next episode out of curiosity and not out of, the hope of better things. So sadly, I wish that I could like it, but 0 out of 2.
Okay, our final category is creativity. And out of 1 point, I give this no points. All of the elements are here, and yet they are messy and confusing. It's almost like if you took a jigsaw puzzle and you shoved and forced and cut and re-glued pieces to fit together, and you said, look, I did it. All the pieces that you love are here. I did it. I made a new thing. And somebody looks at it and you're like, but this is all wrong. And that's kind of how I feel about this. And I feel like they did so much effort and money into something that feels vapid and shallow. And I hate to say it that harshly, but by comparison, it is. And like you mentioned with personal taste and preference, maybe this just isn't for me. Like maybe this is designed to start a new generation of Avatar fans, and this is the gateway because they aren't into or don't have access to, which is not true because the original series is also on Netflix. But for whatever reason, somebody hasn't watched Avatar, but they'll watch this Netflix thing. So we're going to get some more fans. Well, okay, sure, but then why not deliver to them a more true depiction to them? And I think that it's just, I don't know, it feels like the catfished version of the show. And so you may love it if you may love it, but it's not the same. It's just not. Like I said, like all the elements are here, all the pieces are present, but it's packaged and delivered in a messy, confusing way. And if that's what you're into, cool. And there may be people out there that severely disagree with both me and Holland, and that's fine. You are entitled to do that. I hope you love it. Somebody should, because they spent way too much time and money making this for everybody to hate it. I hope there's somebody out there that absolutely adores it. We are just not those people. And I cannot attribute any points to creativity knowing that everything that they created was to the detriment of things that already exist in the world and for the characters. So for that reason, I had to give it 0 points for creativity.
Alrighty. I also give it 0 points for creativity. I remember when I think it was 2010, when the M. Night Shyamalan film came out and it was met with heavy criticism. And I remember when people were speculating, I think this was even before it was announced, and people had always said that they should just make a live action TV show of Avatar, because the biggest problem with the film was they literally tried to fit the entire first season of Avatar into one film. And it was too much. There's too much. You couldn't fit it all in. And so the suspected solution was to make it a TV show. And I remember when this TV show was announced, everybody thought it was great, especially because it got the original creators involved. And because of that, fans of the show's expectations were, great, we've got the original creators and we're doing a TV series, so we have plenty of time to do the original justice, and we have the people on board to do the original justice. So this was a long-awaited TV series, live action rendition of a beloved animated series, and it fails to do anything new, and any changes made only seem to harm rather than help the story, the characters, and they just don't do the original justice. I think overall, this will go down in history as the adaptation where, well, at least they got Aang's name right. So for that, I just 0 out of 1.
Fair enough.
So what was your final score?
My final score is 3 out of 10.
Ooh.
That's very low for me.
Is that your lowest?
I don't think so. I actually don't remember.
My final score is 2 out of 10.
That's pretty low.
Which is really low. And I struggled really hard scoring this because this is actually lower than episode 2 of One Piece. And I really hoped that somehow this wouldn't be worse than the second episode of One Piece, which I really disliked. But unfortunately, it's now lower than the second episode of One Piece. It's lower than Persuasion for me.
I'm looking at all of our old scores, and this is tied for my lowest score. The only other thing I have ranked this low is Eclipse. Twilight's Eclipse.
Yep. So it's not as bad as Twilight, but it's actually worse for me than Persuasion and the second episode of One Piece, which I really disliked. So we expected so much of you, Avatar the Last Airbender, the Netflix show.
You also ranked Over the Garden Wall as only 2.
Oh, I did?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. I didn't remember that. And we just did that episode.
Yeah, the only things that you've done lower was New Moon and Eclipse.
Twilight got higher than 2?
Let me see. No, it didn't. So all 3 of the Twilight films that we've done are lower than this, but...
Okay. That's sad if you're lower than Twilight. All right. Any final thoughts?
No final thoughts.
Okay. All right. Ready for lightning round?
Ready.
Okay. Best or favorite character adaptation?
Oh, I guess Aang. It's still not great, but I think Aang.
I think I would say Gyatso.
Okay.
He's not terrible.
He actually, at least his depiction was pretty close to his original.
Yeah. And I felt like he hit the tone okay. Mm-hmm. Actually, no. I would say this is my real answer. Like, legit. You know, in the Air Nomad Council, the head Air Nomad guy who's like, Aang will leave. He's going to go start his training. That guy was exactly like the animated.
Even his voice sounded like
he was younger, but he fit perfectly. So I would say him.
Okay.
All right. Worst or least favorite character adaptation?
Katara.
Really?
Or Gran.
Yeah.
I guess Gran. If I have to pick, it was bad.
What was up with Gran? Like,
Gran
she sounded like a robot.
And she acted like she had like an eternal wedgie. Like,
what?
You know what I mean? Like,
no.
She's just a little uncomfortable and does not want to be here.
Oh, okay.
Like, she's just a little annoyed and can't like take care of, her discomfort. She just kind of seemed like she just didn't want to be here. Very cold, like no warmth. It was so wrong.
Yeah. I think my least favorite, Gran was horrible, but I think my least favorite was probably Iroh. I felt like they did that man dirty.
They did him dirty, yeah.
Like, not the actor, but the character of Iroh. They just did him so dirty.
Yeah.
Favorite visual moment or like visual aspect, either a set or scenery or costume or some visual.
I think the entire Fire Nation ship that Zuko is on looks directly out of the animated series. Like the design of the ship, the look of the ship, the like inside parts that we see all fit the bill. The lighting was almost identical to how they light it in the animated series. So I think the Fire Nation ship, like Zuko's ship.
I think I would say the Fire Nation, including Zuko's armor that they wear, was probably my favorite. Like
just the aesthetic of the people?
No, like the costume pieces.
Yeah, that's
I
what
thought were really good. Yeah.
So, but you mean like when you say the Fire Nation, you mean like the people of the Fire Nation?
No. I mean Zuko and his crew when they come off the ship wearing their armor.
Okay.
To go to the gate at the South Pole. That Their costumes, I
Okay.
think, were probably my favorite.
I gotcha.
Like, if I had to pick a specific, like, costume, that's probably... My visual would be one of the costumes, and that would be the costume that I
Okay,
would
I
pick.
got you.
What do you think the best looking bending was, since we did see all 4 elements?
I mean, I have issues with all of them, but I think the most natural looking one was probably the fire bending, with the exception of combustion. So, taking that aside, I think that the fire CG looked the best of the 4 elements.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the firebending looked the best. But I also think that... I don't know. I mean, I would say it looked the best out of all the other bending, but I also think that even still, firebending and like CG fire still doesn't look as real as real fire when it's on film, you know? So
Yeah.
it still looks like CGI fire, which is sad that it still looks like... And water, too. Fire and water, both of them. It still looks like 2010 animation. What change would you make to this first episode?
I would cut everything out that happens before the scene of Sokka and Katara, like, going out and stumbling upon the iceberg. Just get rid of it. Put it later or don't put it in at all. I don't care. But start the show where the show should start instead of filling in all of this stuff we don't need. I think that alone would have shifted the entire trajectory of not just the episode, but the season and the entirety of the show.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I would do the same. Yeah. And not if I couldn't pick that, I would pick that do these kids some better justice and give them some more time to really get more familiar with each other and more familiar with their characters. I just feel like
I mean, it's possible
they pulled them right out of the audition scene and into the stage. Like,
it's possible that it does get better. I guess the only way to know that would be to continue watching episodes. But like, you know, like sometimes you film the pilot episode much earlier and then you get it all ready because you have to pitch it or whatever. So it is possible that is part of the problem, is that like they got the script, they got on set, they're nervous, they don't really know these people. You have to act like you know and care for and have relationships with these people that you do not know. They're like absolute strangers to you, but you have to pretend like they're not. And so because of their youth or lack of direction, it does come across like that. Maybe it gets better. I don't know.
Yeah.
It could be, but I mean, all we have is this first episode to gauge off of, and it's pretty stark.
yeah. I wonder, the scene that felt the most organic between Katara and Sokka was one of the first interaction between the two of them.
Is it when they're in the boat, like heading to the...
It's before they even get into the boat.
Okay.
It's when Sokka's saying, like, you know, the fishing boats came back empty. If you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. And she said, oh, they just don't listen to your leadership or whatever. And she like teases him and he's like, yeah, they don't. And then he realizes she's making fun of him.
Yeah.
And then he's like, oh, come on. Or something. I'm just paraphrasing because I don't remember it beat for beat. But I felt like that was the most organic reaction or interaction between those two characters. And it made me wonder if that was so organic because maybe that was their audition scene, you know?
Maybe.
I mean, it's completely conjecture, but
Yeah.
that's what it felt like, that they had done that scene together before and everything else was just done cold.
Yeah, true.
You know, that's just what it felt like. I'm not saying I know for sure that's not based on anything. All right. Last lightning round question. If you had to pick one of the Netflix characters to fight against their animated counterparts, which one would you want to see and who do you think would win?
Ooh. Iroh against Iroh. Animated Iroh is kicking butt.
That's so true.
Yeah.
That's so true. I think that's the best answer.
Yeah. Animated Iroh would kick his butt and then brew tea and pour it on him. I don't know. But like this sad Santa version of Iroh is just not it.
Yeah. I think I would want animated Sokka and this Sokka to fight each other. And I think animated Sokka would win.
Yeah, probably.
Sokka didn't even pull out his boomerang.
I know. Does he not have it? I
I
don't know.
saw something in his on his belt.
It wasn't acknowledged in
It
this
wasn't.
version.
No. And that was like the whole comedic relief was that he threw his boomerang and missed Zuko, and then it came back and hit him.
Yeah.
You know?
But there's no comedy from Sokka in this
nothing.
episode, which is such a shame.
Well, guys, thank you so much for joining on this episode, and thank you so much for listening to season 2. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. We hope you had a good time. If you didn't, feel free to tell us why. Links to our show notes, Patreon, socials, and a suggestion box are all on our website at lineandmousepodcast.com. You can also review this episode on whichever podcast platform you prefer and let us know what you think. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we will catch you in the next one.